Take your seats. We will begin with our introduction of Dr. Beatty, who is our second lecturer for our lecture series this semester in freshman seminar. The full biography for Dr. Beatty is on Blackboard, of course, so I won't read all of it. I'll hit some of the highlights and then get out of the way so that he can complete his lecture. Dr. Beatty is an associate professor in the Department of Afro-American Studies and associate chair of Afro-American Studies at Howard University. He received his BA degree in Black World Studies and History at Miami University, his MA degree in Black Studies at The Ohio State University, and his PhD degree in African American Studies from Temple University. As Dr. Carr mentioned last night when he introduced Dr. Beatty, he's one of the few people who has 3 degrees, all of his degrees in African American Studies. Prior to coming to Howard, Dr. Beatty served as chairperson of the Department of African American Studies at Chicago State and chair of the Department of African World Studies at Morris Brown College. In May 2008, he became the first African American to present a paper at the 10th International Congress of Egyptologists in Rhodes, Greece. One of the foremost American students of ancient Egyptian language of his generation, Dr. Beatty has also mastered Hieratic, Demotic, Really, it didn't read like Demotic and language, and Coptic language, enabling him to conduct translations of texts that stretch between nearly 3,000 years of classical African history. He currently serves as president of the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations and is also an active member of the American Research Center in Egypt, the Egyptological Seminar in New York, the Sheikh Anta Diop Institute of Egyptology and African Civilization, and the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, among others. Dr. Beatty's research interests include the ancient Egyptian language, history, wisdom literature, astronomy, and ancient Egyptian religious texts, comparative analysis of African cultures, the image and use of ancient Africa in the African American historical imagination, the theory and practice of African American studies, and Pan-Africanism. Slowing down is good. The hashtag for today is the same as always, HU Movements. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Mario Beatty.
Good afternoon. It's great to be with you here this afternoon. The title of this presentation is Abandonment and Dismemberment, Something Torn and New. And I'd like to start off with just a little slide on Dick Gregory. And some of you may have attended part of the service for Dick Gregory that was held here at Howard University this past Friday. And he had a wonderful service for him at City of Praise Ministries in Landover, Maryland. It was 6.5 hours long, actually. People coming from all over the country and the world to pay tribute to this brother. But this is a quote from the program itself. And it says, "This isn't a revolution of black against white. This is a revolution of right against wrong. And right has never lost." And if you want to understand what being a part of a movement is, and giving your life and sacrificing your life to something greater and bigger than yourself, study the life of this revered elder. Study his works. Study all of the various movements that he has participated in to make life better. Not just for African Americans, but for all people in this country. He lived a wonderful, meaningful life, and it's indeed an honor to start this presentation in memory of him. Part of this presentation deals with what we call the dismemberment. And this dismemberment deals with the Middle Passage, and that is the forcible removal of at least 20 million Africans from the continent from the beginnings of the early 15th century AD all the way to the 19th century AD. And the forcible removal of those Africans to various parts of the diaspora in the New World, in the Caribbean, in the Americas, and South America. And dealing with the impact that this dismemberment had on those African people is extremely important. But there is another dismemberment that happens on the continent of Africa itself. And so from the 15th through the 19th century, Europeans spent time removing African people from the continent. But throughout the 19th century, culminating in the late 19th century in the Berlin Conference in 1884 and 1885, the Europeans begin to take the continent from Africans. And they meet and they decide to carve up the continent into their own, initially, spheres of influence, and then to create the colonial boundaries, the lines that you see on the map of Africa today, that various African ethnicities and peoples inhabit. And so the impact of those two dismemberments have been great, and there are overlapping similarities, but there are also some differences that we need to account for. And this is a map charting the forcible removal of African peoples from the continent into the New World. And this is, of course, a modern political map of the continent of Africa, showing you the outgrowth and result of that dismemberment process. But your book that you're reading for freshman seminar by Toni Morrison, The Origin of Others. Toni Morrison starts this book by giving a personal vignette, and then she quickly moves into a discussion of scientific racism. And she says one purpose of scientific racism is to identify an outsider in order to define oneself. And she gives an example from a physician named Samuel Cartwright, very prominent physician, that looked at African people on the plantations and attributed diseases to them for various behaviors that they exhibited. So if you were an enslaved African attempting to run away from the plantation, Samuel Cartwright said, "Oh no, this Negro got a disease. We're going to call that disease drapetomania." The disease that causes African people to run away from the plantation. African people working from sunup to sundown on tobacco plantations, cotton plantations. And he says, the mental lethargy and laziness that accumulates from that process, these Negroes got a disease. We're going to call that disease Dysesthesia aethiopica. This idea, or these ideas, are absurd on their face. In fact, the whole ideological apparatus of scientific racism can be summed up in one phrase: fake news. It means nothing. Their descriptions of others are not based on facts or evidence. Everything that they say and do, as Toni Morrison said, says more about them than it does about the people that they are attempting to describe. And so when we're looking at the origins, are trying to get at the origins of this thing that we say causes the dismemberment of African people. It's very important that we look at it for what it is, but also to look at it as systematically as we can, because there are a lot of different interpretations. And Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote the preface to Toni Morrison's book. And Ta-Nehisi Coates says, when we say race as opposed to racism, we reify the idea that race is somehow a feature of the natural world and racism the predictable result of it. Despite the body of scholarship that has accumulated to show that this formulation is backwards, that racism precedes race, Americans still haven't quite gotten the point. That is, racism created race. And although we can say that as a social, historical, and political force, race in the modern world, especially in our context in the United States, is very real. But notice, Ta-Nehisi Coates is saying that it's not real in the ways that we tend to think that it's real. That is, that it's not real as a part of the natural world. And that's a subtle distinction, but a very important one to contextualize this thing that is causing the dismemberment of not just African people, but humanity also. And so there are some critical questions that I want you to ask yourself as you're looking at different scholars that attempt to address this issue. One question I want you to ask yourself is racism primarily an outgrowth of the European Atlantic slave trade? Does race and racism as a type of othering, what I would say a particular type of othering, play a role in all human constructions of identity and relationships past and present? Is this something that's always been with us? Does the origins of racism lie in Europe and precede the European Atlantic slave trade? And if so, when does it develop? All critical questions that many scholars have attempted to address. And I want to give a sampling today of some of the scholars and their approaches and the different types of evidence that they utilize to attempt to frame the discussion of that issue. First scholar I want to talk about is Frank Snowden. And Frank Snowden was in the classics department here at Howard University from 1940 to 1976, over 3 decades. He was the dean of the College of Liberal Arts. And Frank Snowden was a very, very prominent scholar in the field of classics and did a lot of work on blacks in antiquity. And he wrote another book called Before Color Prejudice. But Frank Snowden in this work, Blacks in Antiquity, is trying to look at evidence in Greco-Roman texts, and he's trying to look at the image of blacks in art in the Greco-Roman world to come to some conclusion on how were black people framed in that world. And his conclusions were that, one, color was not an inherent obstacle to black people interacting and engaging and being absorbed into the Greco-Roman world. That was the first thing that he concluded. And the second thing that he concluded was that the image of blacks in the Greco-Roman world was much more positive than the image of blacks that would actually come after that world. And he tries to demonstrate this through a range of texts. And there are other scholars like David Goldenberg, who wrote a book called The Curse of Ham, Race and Slavery in Early Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. He agrees with Frank Snowden in the main in terms of framing blacks in antiquity. And his question is, he focuses not on Greco-Roman texts, his focus is on the Bible as a text and the use of that text in antiquity. And so he starts his discussion in the 4th century AD among Syriac Christians, and he says that this curse of Ham, there is no evidence that this curse of Ham is linked to black people or slavery in the Bible. That's fake news. But what he is saying is that what is the use of this curse of Ham? So anyone unfamiliar with the curse of Ham, of course, this is Noah had 3 sons, Ham, Shem, Japheth, and Ham being the son who looked upon his father's nakedness. And that in Noah's eyes was deemed as something that should be cursed. And so Ham was cursed, and his descendants were cursed in Canaan to forever be subordinate and slaves as a result. And so what Goldenberg is looking at is how this story in the Bible was used. How did this story begin to develop and be linked to blackness and slavery? And he says that this wasn't really a part of the first kind of 3 centuries of Christianity in antiquity. But something begins to happen in the 4th century AD where this story begins to be linked to an anti-black sentiment. And then he says that this anti-black sentiment begins to increase in the 7th century AD with the coming of a new religion called Islam. And when that religion comes on the world stage, he says in the 7th century AD that Jews, Christians, and Muslims, that you can see it, that they begin to use this curse of Ham as a rationale to enslave people of darker colors, black people. And this curse of Ham would ripple all the way up to the modern era. And it would be indeed used for people using the Bible as a text to rationalize slavery. This would be the main rationale used to justify that. We have another brother close to Howard University, teaches at American University, a brother named Ibram Kendi, who just wrote a book called Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. And he tries to look at the early American colonists, and he tries to see what it motivates these ideas, these early colonists, in terms of their racism. And what he concludes is that these colonists are largely calling upon the ideas of certain Greek philosophers in antiquity, primarily Aristotle. And Aristotle is a 4th century BC Greek philosopher. And Aristotle took the position that there was an inferiority that was based not on biology, but based on climate. And so Aristotle took the position that the Greeks themselves were in a temperate climate, and that people that were in a hotter climate than them and people that were in a colder climate than them were inferior. And that inferiority led to a couple of things. It led to their incapacity to actually develop fully concepts of freedom in his idea, and it also led to those people's incapacity to develop forms of self-government. So there were, for Aristotle, political implications of how these ideas are laid out and grounded. And so Ibram Kendi largely locates the origins of racism in the slave trade and invoking that these early American colonists are selectively invoking these ideas as kind of inspiration, part of their inspiration to rationalize what they do. And then there is Cedric Robinson, who wrote a book called Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition. And Cedric Robinson approaches this question from a different angle. And right from the start, the first paragraph in this book lays out the thesis for the whole book. And he says the historical development of world capitalism was influenced in a most fundamental way by the particularistic forces of racism and nationalism. This could only be true if the social, psychological, and cultural origins of racism and nationalism both anticipated capitalism in time and formed a piece with those events that contributed directly to its organization of production and exchange. Feudal society is the key. More particularly, the antagonistic commitments, structures, and ambitions that feudal society encompass are better conceptualized as those of a developing civilization than as elements of a unified tradition. What is he saying? He's saying that before the slave trade, in feudal society, in the Middle Ages in Europe, that feudal society means the absence of a strong state. And in the absence of a strong state, you have a great deal of antagonisms that occur inside Europe. And these antagonisms are leading toward, that are happening in the social and cultural environment, are leading to ideas, fixed ideas of superiority and inferiority that are based on the body, but these are Europeans fighting other Europeans. And then when the slave trade comes, those ideas that have already been articulated inside Europe, like a match, begin to be elaborated and extended to African bodies. So Robinson's approach is not to necessarily reach all the way back and to look at key thinkers like Aristotle or even Plato. He says, no, you have to deal with the civilization itself that produced this, that goes far beyond just individual thinkers. That's a different approach. And lastly, Benjamin Isaac wrote a book called The Invention of Racism in Classical Antiquity. It's probably misappropriately titled. It probably should be The Invention of Proto-Racism in Classical Antiquity, because that's the concept that he uses really throughout the book. And what he is saying is that despite people like Frank Snowden and David Goldenberg taking the position that the image of blacks in the Greco-Roman world is more positive than people would like to think. But what Benjamin Isaac is saying that, yeah, that may be the case. But in the Greco-Roman world, you have the articulation of ideas of superiority and inferiority that are not just sometimes based on somatic features, but that are also articulated in ways that they are framed vis-a-vis the human being as unalterable. And so this idea of racism, the cause of this dismemberment, at its essence, this idea is the creation of hierarchies. And it's attributing values of superiority and inferiority to those hierarchies based upon these imagined traits, whether they be physical, mental, moral. And these imagined traits are framed as being unalterable by human will. Because they are framed as being either hereditary, that is fixed in your body, or like Aristotle, these attributes are framed in terms of things like climate and geography. But still, what Isaac is saying is that they're still framed, even though they may not have the rigid nature of being hereditary and based on biology, of what racism, the racism that we know would come. He's saying that these ideas, even though they're maybe based on things like climate, are still framed in ways that are unalterable by particular groups. That is, you can't change them. So it's a type of othering that becomes reified and fixed. So Benjamin Isaac's point is that these ideas, the beginnings of these ideas, are already being articulated in Greco-Roman realities and texts and among philosophers. Different approaches to the causes of the dismemberment. But then once we deal with the causes of the dismemberment, we also have to deal with how the dismemberment is framed itself. And who is framing the dismemberment? Who is interpreting the dismemberment? And the subtitle of my presentation is Something Torn and New. And this subtitle comes from the work of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, a very famous Kenyan writer. Something Torn and New, an African Renaissance. And Thiong'o compares the dismemberment in the continent and in the diaspora. And in the continent, he asks a question: did the death intended for one's means of memory actually materialize? And in the diaspora, he asks, how do you raise buried memory from the grave when the means of raising it are themselves buried in the grave or suffocated to the level of whispering ghosts? And what he's getting at here is that the dismemberment takes place differently on the continent and the diaspora. That on the continent, you have European colonizers coming in, but the histories, the culture, even much of the mythology, the cosmologies, all of those things are there. They're surrounding the colonizer, but they become not valued. In the diaspora, there is a greater assault on those memories, on history, on culture. And that greater assault is something that you have to account for in terms of framing this question, or answering or addressing this question. And on the African continent, he looks at things like Western education, Western Christianity, creating a submissive African middle class, and the condemnation of African culture, the religion, the drumming, the dancing, dress, names, rites of passage, ceremonies, etc. There are many examples that we could give of this. But he's saying is that when you create, for example, if you have a school or a college on the continent of Africa, it might be as simple as all instruction must take place in French. No instruction can take place in an African language, whatever your African language is. You can play those drums outside, but you can't play them in here. You can be Kofi in your community, but when you come into this setting, you John. That's what he's getting to, is that there is an orientation that is linked to the West that cajoles African people on the continent away from themselves, where they indeed begin to see themselves as the other. And in the diaspora, he says that these ruptures are much more substantial, because African people are forced to deal with race, with white supremacy, and the various economic, political, and cultural interactions and transformations in the New World. And so how do those Africans in the diaspora deal with this? And indeed on the continent. And Thiongo gives two kind of major approaches. And one he calls the African idea, and the second one he calls the idea of Africa. And the idea of Africa to Thiongo is the West's system of self-representation. That is, to use Toni Morrison, this is like framing Africa as other. And for Thiongo, the African idea is Africans themselves in the diaspora and the continent that begin to take charge of their history, of their culture, of their political economic systems, of government. They begin to take charge of those things, and they begin to try to frame what this dismemberment was for them, and they begin to try to frame how to get out of that mess themselves. And so they become the architects and authors of their own destiny. So the African idea gives African people a sense of agency in the process of overcoming dismemberment. And so on the continent, there are scholars that you should be aware of. Actually, many scholars, but I don't have time to cite a lot, but I want to cite one. On the continent, Cheikh Anta Diop. This brother was born in Senegal, in Diourbel, Senegal. The university in Senegal is named after him now, the University of Cheikh Anta Diop. And this brother went on to Paris to study at the Sorbonne. And what makes him special is that he attempted to unite the humanities, the social sciences, and the natural sciences all in one, to bring to bear on the examination of African people in space and time. He took advanced chemistry. He built the first radiocarbon dating laboratory on the African continent. He studied advanced linguistics, sociology, philosophy, Egyptology, prehistory, anthropology. This brother was a multi-genius. And what Cheikh Anta Diop did, the essence of his work, was that African people need an ideological rupture. That is, for sure, African people have to sever themselves from these ideas of racism and white supremacy that see African people as not only other, but inferior. But that's only the first step. The second step is that African people need an epistemological rupture. That is, once you know what you're against, the epistemological rupture is now, what is it that you're for? And when you're building knowledge, how do you build knowledge of African people based upon the internal frames of reference of those people and not based upon European colonial paradigms as your master? And lastly, you're doing this for what? And for him, it's to build a historical consciousness and awareness in African people, in space and time. And it doesn't matter whether it's good or bad. For him, it just matters that African people are reconciled with their history so that they can use that history, as all human cultures do, to build a world that they want to see in the future. And so, one of your thinkers, one of your teachers in freshman seminar, Greg Carr, wrote an article, a very famous article called What Black Studies Is Not. And in this article, Carr talks about a number of different approaches to examining Africana phenomena. And two of these approaches are the Black radical tradition and the sui generis approach. And he says the Black radical tradition approach links ideas of African cultural unity, that is, the ideas that people, scholars like Sheikh Anta Diop, were attempting to institute in their work, to the material context and circumstances of Western racialization and racial hierarchy. And then he says there is a sui generis approach that takes the modern era as the point of departure for theorizing large-scale African identity and organizes itself around the principle of perpetual improvisation, polycentered contestation, and the idea of blackness as a social construct drawing upon an indefinable range of characteristics, identities, and/or experiences. What is he saying? He's saying that as African people in the New World, the sui generis approach is a very limiting approach because it cajoles you and it forces you to frame your identity in terms of the limiting concept of race, of blackness versus whiteness. And when you have that limiting paradigm, your frame becomes always how close or far you are away from that standard. And in addition to that, your frame assumes that African people are empty. Empty of history, empty of culture. And so because they're empty, they are constantly framed and compared against a white standard. And he's saying that if you think that African people have a history, have a culture that stands on its own in time and space, then the interpretation of that history and culture by fact, based on evidence, has to transcend race. It doesn't mean that race doesn't matter. It means that in charting the fullness of African humanity, something else matters more. Thank you, brother. I got my one-man amen corner up front. Thank you, brother. But August Wilson, a very famous African-American playwright, was very attuned to this. How many people saw the movie Fences? How many of you saw that? Okay, it's wonderful. And with Denzel Washington. But August Wilson, of course, attempted with his work, tried to write plays covering every decade of the African experience in the United States. And so you have to understand the goal of what he's trying to do and trying to accomplish in his work. And so he's asked a question about the African population. This is an interview in 1990. And he says, I think that it's certainly a part of Black American culture, particularly over the past 40 years, when white America issued a social contract that said that you can participate in the society if you are willing to deny the fact that you are African, that you cannot bring your Africanness inside the door. So for August Wilson, he's trying to bring Africa inside the door on its own terms. But he's saying that this society and the standards of this society are mitigating against that imperative. And so he says, well, why are you trying to bring it inside the door? And his answer to that question is because it's there. And he says, I think that the fundamental question that has confronted blacks since the Emancipation Proclamation is, are we going to adopt the values of the dominant culture, or are we going to maintain our cultural separateness and continue to develop the culture that has been developing in the southern United States for some 200 or 300 years? The African who arrived chained and malnourished in the hold of a 350-ton Portuguese vessel, he has not vanished from the face of the earth. He is here, in whatever manifestation, alive in the 30 million black people who are in this country now. And so, if that's the case, how do we elevate scholars, and how do we look at the scholars that are doing the spade work of trying to get us to see that and the political implications of that for our lives? And one brother, one of the most prominent brothers that I want to highlight is Sterling Stuckey, who wrote a very famous book called Slave Culture. And this book deals with, of course, kind of re-Africanized Christianity, I'll say, in the United States. But it deals with rituals that he calls the ring shout primarily, and how those rituals become central to African people. There's rituals about the things that you do. And so there are all of these African rituals that begin to find their way, of course, into the practice of Christianity that people aren't describing as African, although that is the case. Christian is just the label. But when you look and you take the label off and you look inside the bottle is African. That is, it precedes, and indeed it's not linked to the articulation of that faith in ways that we think it is. And so he complicates that question. And he says that most historians of slavery so far have done little more than grope in the dark for the African origins of slave artistry. Young scholars will find the field wide open if they will look beyond paternalistic assumptions of European cultural superiority and investigate the records of slave accomplishments. So before we examine this data, we have to have, as a scholar, as a researcher, a different type of mindset that we utilize to engage that data. That is, that when we engage this data, you can't assume that there is nothing there that links or is linked to Africa or where those people come from. And this is his major point. But there are other scholars that are doing wonderful work in this area. Sylviane Joff, who was at the Schomburg in New York, wrote a great book called Slavery's Exiles, The Story of the American Maroons. And she charts, we know about the Maroon communities in Jamaica and Trinidad and Haiti and Brazil, all across the Caribbean and the Americas. And Sylvia and Joff says, yeah, we know that. We know that. Many studies have been done on that. But not a lot of work has been done on the American Maroons. That is, the African people in the United States that developed these very elaborate maroon communities. And what a maroon community is Africans running away. I guess they had drapetomania. Running away from the plantation and trying to recreate their lives as African people in this country. And she focuses on Virginia and South Carolina, all of these elaborate maroon communities. And the fascinating thing is that when you look at these communities and you look at the early African experience in this country, is that these African people have conceptions of living and conceptions of freedom that transcend the United States Constitution. And they're not mirror images of the United States Constitution. And it makes sense. When you actually ask yourself, would an enslaved, not just African, but an enslaved person of any hue or color, would an enslaved person of any hue or color have the same conception of freedom as the person who was enslaving them? Huh? Yes or no? No. Say it louder. H-U, you know? No. Give the answer for you. Of course not. But you're not, but you don't ask that question. You know, we don't ask that question. Because that question leads us to some place where our identity is pitted up against this nation state. It's a troubling question. But when you actually look at the data, you begin to find a range of perspectives. And that is what these scholars are trying to unearth. And lastly, I will cite the work of Michael Gomez, who wrote a book called Exchanging Our Country Marks, The Transformation of African Identities in the Colonial and Antebellum South. And all Michael Gomez does is that he says that African people come to the New World with their own identities and ethnicities. And so he just simply asks a question. He says, what are their cosmologies? What are their worldviews? What are their values? What are their beliefs? And then how do those beliefs play out on the American landscape? And he looks at slave advertisements primarily as a major documentary source of evidence. And he looks at things like Denmark Vesey's revolts, a lot of different things that he looks at, all the way up to 1820. And he comes to the conclusion that what you're seeing play out in the United States are really African ethnicities operating largely on their own terms on the American landscape. And over time, those African ethnicities begin to come together and make a composite African based upon their collective experiences. And then it begins to be distilled into this limiting idea of race that African people populate with their own intentions that go beyond the physical idea. And they begin to import their own ideas of history and culture using that limiting concept of race, but nevertheless still affirming their own African humanity in the process. And this continuity of Africa is seen literally in every area. In art, in music, in literature, in dress, in architecture, tools, food, language, philosophy, knowledge, religion, family patterns, political culture, rituals, literally every area of reflective and expressive culture. And so I leave you with the affirmation that in order to fully frame and interpret African humanity, you have to, with all of your being, know that Africa is not inferior to Europe or to anyone. Africa is equal. And if you see Africa as equal, that mindset will find its way to the sensitivity that you approach the data in which you're interpreting. And once you have that sensitivity as a scholar and a researcher, that the knowledge that you bring of African people can help us to transcend fake news and help us to get nearer to the reality that we see that African people inhabit every day of their lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you again to Dr. Beatty. We hope that you have a good